Hello, welcome everyone to Synergy 210, integrating with Citrix Cloud APIs. My name is Tom Clutie. I am a principal architect with Citrix Cloud, primarily focused on the platform. I've been with Citrix for 19 years, and with me is Joel Stocker.
Hey guys, my name is Joel Stocker. I'm part of the Citrix Cloud Platform Product Management team. I've been only with Citrix for 17 years. Tom and I are doing this session because he's obviously the expert. I'm more kind of an amateur developer. Many unfinished projects, but it is kind of a hobby of mine. So we worked on this together, and I hope you enjoy it. Tom?
Thank you. So first of all, I wanted to talk about our approach to APIs in Citrix Cloud. So we actually have 5 kind of guiding principles here. The first is that we want to make sure that your transition to the cloud is easy. And so it's really important to us that we have backward compatibility with our pre-cloud APIs. So if you already have scripts that work with Zen Desktop, if you have integrations that work with Zen Mobile, we want those to work when you start to consume those services from the cloud. Secondly, moving beyond those legacy APIs, we want to support modern technologies, REST plus JSON over HTTP. That really enables a real rich development environment with cross-platform, cross-language, cross-network, cross-everything support. REST and JSON is emerging as sort of the de facto way of doing APIs in the cloud. We want to make sure that we have modern documentation with both low-level documentation using OpenAPI, formerly known as Swagger, as well as high-level documentation that's kind of guides you to the APIs that you need in order to accomplish a task. And for that, we want to leverage Read the Docs, which again is more of a modern technology, modern platform out there for creating that high-level documentation. We want to make sure that no matter what service you're consuming from Citrix Cloud and you want to integrate with, you should be able to do that always with the same authentication and customer context. It becomes very, very difficult if you have to authenticate differently to call different APIs, and it makes it seem like a much less cohesive solution overall. And finally, we want to have some common practices across our APIs so that it all seems like it's coming from one company, so that when you're familiar with how things work within one service, you should be able to go to another service and already have a baseline understanding of how to use the API. So how are we doing on these guidelines? Now this is sort of an honest assessment. We're not doing perfect. We have a lot left to do. But across the left you can see all the services that are in Citrix Cloud. Across the top you can see those guidelines, guidelines that we have. And there's a couple of areas where we have still some improvement to do. In the documentation column, we have documentation for most of our services. We have not put it all into the modern documentation formats, but it is all out there. And later in the presentation, I'll show you a slide that, and it'll be available after the session, that has links to the documentation for all of these different services. There's also a couple of our newer services that just because of their newness, they haven't yet built that customer-facing API yet. This is the slide I mentioned. This is showing where do you find all that documentation. So each of the different services has documentation out there. You can go and find it from these links. It's in different formats, but it is all consumable, and you can use those APIs directly today against Citrix Cloud. So with that, I'll hand over to Joel.
All right. Thanks, Tom. All right. Well, first of all, kind of I'm not sure if I want to say highlight, but kind of unique for all of you in the audience. I think you are the smallest audience I've had in my 17 years presenting at iForums and Synergy. And I think it has to do with the time and also with the subject matter. API is not for everybody, but you are definitely going to be obviously leading the pack, which we expect. And what we're going to do the rest of this presentation is we still have slides, but we're also going to do a lot of demos. So in the next section, I will talk about the documentation and how you can actually contribute to our documentation. So our API documentation is crowdsourced in a way, and you can actually create pages, submit them, and I will show you how to do that. And we then take that and run that through our engineering cycle so that it will get on the website. So we'll talk about that, and then after that I'm going to talk about how you actually create a secure API client, which is of course essential to actually even start working with the Citrix Cloud APIs. And finally, in my allotted time, I will also talk about two tools which are very useful for you when you start, if you're not familiar with it yet. So it's both for the beginner useful tools as well as for the expert useful tools to use when you start developing things with the Citrix API and you want to get more familiar with the REST API for Citrix Cloud. And then Tom will come back and he will spend the rest of the session, about 20 minutes, on actually building some examples in different languages and show you, kind of like get you started, and so that once you come home for Friday or maybe Monday, that you can immediately start building cool things with the Citrix Cloud API. So, like I said, we'll start with developer.cloud.com, and Tom already mentioned it. This is where we store currently the documentation for Citrix Cloud, as well as where we started building out the documentation for XenApp Desktop Service. Now, there are different locations for developer documentation inside Citrix, and that was on the previous slide. There is a goal to eventually all consolidate that in a single location, and I guess whichever team does it best, they get the edge in which platform that will be. And this documentation is maintained by our engineering team. So our developers maintain this, but you and anybody really can contribute to the documentation. Not blindly, obviously, but we do a review together with, so Tom is involved in that, and some of our engineers are involved in that. Myself will be involved in that, so to make sure that it's not only technically accurate, but that not some joker like types in VMware rocks in the middle of the page, right? So we need to make sure that, that this is official documentation from Citrix. And once it is reviewed, so you submit it, and we'll talk about how you do that. Once it is reviewed by us, we actually push it through our normal engineering cycle. So it goes through a BVT, build verification testing, then it goes into our staging environment, and then it gets rolled into production. So there's an actual engineering practice behind actually publishing the documentation you have created. Now, what you will see is that when you open one of these documentation pages, or if you want to create a new one, it's not just standard HTML. We use, like you already said, read the docs, and that converts the what is called the restructured text format into HTML pages using Sphinx and Python, and the way it is formatted, the underlining, italic, all those kind of things are kind of different. It is not the standard. You probably worked with maybe some tools like Slack. They have their own kind of like things to do text formatting. This one is just a lot bigger because you need to be able to do code samples. You need to be able to do tables, all those kind of things, insert images. We're not going to go into a lot of detail on that. But if you go to this page here, which is listed on this slide, there you will find much more information about the formatting and how you can actually make sure that it looks properly. Because if it doesn't look properly, we're not, well, unless it's small changes, we're not going to redo all the work then, because the idea is that our partners, our customers are actually going to contribute to the documentation. Now there's a bunch of requirements, and this is really depending on, first of all, what platform you use to work from. I use a Windows laptop, so I list those here. And I think that I actually, so there's the contribute link in the second bullet point here. There's more information, and that also has some details on specifically if you're running it from Mac. Now this is just guidance. There's many different ways you can edit text pages, basically, text documents. So we use actually Visual Studio Code because that's the best kind of like visualization with different colors and things like that. But you could use Notepad or Notepad++. If you're really courageous, you could even use the online editor from GitHub themselves. But important is that this is stored, the code is stored on GitHub itself. There's a couple of tools that you need to install before you start working on that, and I've already done that, so I'm not going to go through the whole install process. And, oh, actually, I had one more slide, sorry. And these are kind of the steps we're going to demo for you. So first of all, you go to the Citrix Cloud community dev portal page. You create a fork on GitHub, so you kind of create your own online copy. You pull that online copy down to your local machine. That is where you're going to create pages, where you edit pages. Then you do a couple of checks to make sure that you did it right. You're also actually going to verify if the created HTML code looks properly. So you will see that it's just opening in a browser. Once you've done all that, you basically commit it back to your local copy, push it back into GitHub, and then in GitHub, you will do a pull request to bring it back to Citrix. So I'm going to show you how to do that. All right. Let me just... my cheat sheet here on the phone. All right, so let's first go to the actual page, because if you create a new page, you don't have to go there, but if you maybe see something in the documentation, and that is, of course, excellent timing, but I hope that I don't need that. Of course. This is excellent timing from LastPass to just do that before my demo. Because I do need it for logging in a minute, but not for the first one. So let me do that first, and let me show you the dev portal. So this is the documentation page. It's basically developer.cloud.com, very straightforward. In the meantime, let me approve this one. And of course, I didn't pick it up, so. All right, sorry about that. So let's take a look. You can assume, but it's not always true, that everything on these pages, because they're already published, are correct. There are actually a couple of small typos and things like that, so which I found, because I'm going to correct these in this demo. And specifically on this customer ID page, there is an issue with the naming of the tab. It says the API client tab, and it's actually the API access tab. So I want to change this page, so I now know which page it is, and normally what I first would do is go, of course, to GitHub, assuming that you have an account, you log in, you go to the Cloud Developer one, and you're going to fork, that was the first step, right, from the Citrix version into your own repository. Now I have already done that in my case, because I didn't want to waste the time of creating that fork, although it's pretty fast. But as you can see here, there is one called Dev Portal. So this is actually forked, and it says that here, forked from Citrix Cloud community /Dev Portal. So now I have my own online copy. Now we're going to actually do things locally. And the first thing I need to do is create a clone from this online version. So what I will do is do Git. So this was one of the requirements. You have to install Git. I think on Mac it's by default. No? You also need to install it? Okay. And those links were all in the pages. Okay, GitHub. Virtual job, that's my repository, and then Dev Portal. All right. So now it's creating the clone, so it's bringing everything down. Good network here, so not too many people in the room, of course, so we have all the bandwidth. And once you've done this, in future, so if there's a new version, so you want to pull like the latest version from GitHub, you can just do a git pull. So you don't have to type this whole thing, and that will just do the differences. So it will not bring the whole copy down. So we saw that the edit we want to make. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open Visual Studio Code, because that's the tool I like to use. And this actually has a plugin for kind of that formatting, different colors and things like that. I already pre-installed that. A little bit of Googling will bring you there. And I'm going to add the whole folder I just downloaded. And that is actually this one here. So now you see here the dev portal copy we just created is right here. And under source, you will actually see the page where I just talked about. And this is a good example, right? This doesn't look like HTML at all. This is obviously something that is the read to docs format or the restructured text format. But what you do see is that it says here API client. So we're going to change that to API access. And I was doing some testing earlier to make sure that my demo worked. I removed the period at the end of the sentence. So you can just ignore that. It was not part of the original plan. So of course I save it. And now I need to do a couple of checks on if it created it correctly. Okay, so. And what we do is we go into this one. So again, this is that local copy I created from the clone. And the first thing we're going to do is run make.bat with a link check. And this verifies that all the URLs and all the links in there are not dead links. And there you see some different colors coming by. There's some permanent redirects in there. Those are fine. But obviously a link that doesn't work, especially from one page to the other, is not something you can publish. So it says, okay, it's fine, build succeeded. So now we can go to the next step, is clean up the working directory here with make that clean. And finally, we actually built the HTML code with make.bat HTML. And what you want to do then is, when that builds, let me, in the meantime, open up the directory here. So you see a new directory created called build, and that has a folder called HTML. And there you see customer ID somewhere. There it is. So I can open it up and you see, oh yeah, that looks good. We made the change. Now we are ready to push it back to GitHub. Now there's a couple of commands. We're not going to go into detail, but these are required to push it back into GitHub, git add, and then we're going to actually commit the changes. And you can add a comment in there which appears on the GitHub page. So customer ID page, change the tab naming, something like that. And this is actually real, so this is what our developers are going to see. So I want to make sure that I do this right. And finally, so now I have it all prepared. Now I can push it back into GitHub. So, well, that copies. Let me just go back to the page. Do I still have it here? Yeah. So let me just do a refresh. Let's see if it's done already. It is. And what you will see here is, look at that, customer ID page changed in tab naming just 21 seconds ago. And what do we want to do? Well, we want to pull that and bring that back to Citrix. And of course, wow, everything today. I'm not sure what was going on. Security, isn't it a wonderful thing?
If only this was in Workspace, we would have single sign-on.
That's true. It's time that we roll that out. Right. So it brought me to that page, and now we can see the details. And now it's just a matter of waiting. So we brought it back to Citrix. It now goes to the developers. They get notified once they approve it.
I just got an email saying that there's a pull request ready to be reviewed.
There you go. So he clicks on it. Well, after review, he clicks on it. He says it's okay. Then I get an email through my GitHub account which tells me, okay, it's approved. Now, approved doesn't mean that it's approved, because we still need to go through BVT and staging, and if we find problems there, then obviously we won't approve it. We won't. We'll inform you that that it didn't pass the test, etc.
Right.
All right. So next 5 minutes, I just want to go over the two tools, which are, and let me just go. Oh, and of course I'll speed it up a little bit. All right. So, of course, like I said, a secure API client is key in actually doing anything with the API. It is not needed for the API using the REST APIs, but also using it's being used for the connector silent install, which Tom will talk more about. And the API client is needed because we need to generate a bearer token. And the bearer token, you need the client ID and client secret together to create the bearer token, and the bearer token is then being used for all API requests. And you get this API client through the Citrix Cloud interface. I'm not going to demo that for you because it's really simple. It will also apply all delegated administration and permission settings. So if you reduce the capabilities of an administrator, then they will also have reduced access to the API. So that automatically happens as well. You just go to Citrix Cloud console, you go to identity and access management, you go to the API access tab, not the API client tab, and you basically give it a name. Now keep in mind, you only get one shot in downloading it. So you cannot, after that you cannot retrieve it anymore. The moment you close it first time, you cannot get your secret anymore. You do get the client ID, but not the secret. So make sure that you write it down, or there's a copy and paste button in it, or download it as a text file, I believe it is. You only get one shot at it. Otherwise you need to create a new one. Now there's one situation when if you use federated authentication for the administrators through Azure AD, once you disable this user in AD, in your Azure AD, their API client will still work. So it's very important that you maybe automate that, or that you at least make sure that you actually disable or delete the user also in the Citrix Cloud console. All right, so the two most important tools which I frequently use is F12, developer tools in most common browsers, and Postman. As far as the developer tools, obviously that will give you information about which you can use to actually kind of reverse engineer. So even if we don't have documentation, all our consoles, the web UI for Citrix Cloud uses our APIs, so it talks to the APIs. So if you would just open up the developer tools and you would click something in the Citrix UI, in the Citrix Cloud UI, it will actually show you what kind of commands it sent to the REST API. Now most of those you can use, not all of them. There are certain commands that are privileged, which require something else than a bearer token, but those are mainly for internal use only. So very useful, just in your browser, I think for most browsers F12, yeah. And it will show you in the bottom, make sure that you kind of like keep it, because sometimes it changes pages and removes it again. So if you have never used developer tools, read up on it, it's super easy to use. What is very important is that we do include canary routing information. So we always have two releases, release A and release B. So we switch during our kind of like rollouts from A to B. That is not part of the API call. So if you see something like this, for example, registry ECUS release B, you actually need to kind of remove this a little bit, and then you have the actual REST API call which you need. And as a tip, once you start working with it, if you put this in a browser, so if I would put in registry.citrixworkspaceapi.net in a browser, it will actually give me some additional documentation. So very useful to do that. Now the thing I do want to show you is Postman, because it's a very, I love Postman, but there's a lot of capabilities and they add new stuff to it all the time. And so getpostman.com is where you find it. And what I like to do is actually store the secret and the ID in the tool, so that I don't have to every time have to like manually copy and paste it. So first of all, I store that. And what I can do then is run what they call a test script after the authentication that takes the bearer token and also stores that bearer token in Postman. So every call after that can just grab that key out of that environment settings, the environment settings, and just apply that to every subsequent call. There's a lot of features, like I said, check it out. You can sync across different machines. They now have some team capabilities that you can share it amongst teams. And let me just open up Postman here. Right. See, they have funny developers as well. There we go. All right. And obviously mine is already set up for that. So the first thing I want to show you is the the environments. And the environments is where we can store these kind of keys like the secret, the ID, as well as the bearer token once it's generated. Now I'm not going to show you mine because they are mine and they actually would do something if you would use them. So I created this kind of fake one. I'm not sure how well you can see this, but I created 3 keys in the environment: client ID, client secret, and token. Client ID and client secret, we know, that came from the Citrix Cloud UI when you created it. The token, you can just leave empty, because it will put that in, something in there once I run my first script. And I have like a bunch of calls already here predefined, which I just stored when I was playing around with it. And what I'm going to do is actually, wait, go away. This one is too big. I think I have to create a new client now.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's being recorded, right?
That's right.
Exactly. All right, so what I do is, one of the simple ones, and not sure what's going on there. Did they change this? So apparently something is going wrong in this test, and I didn't even change it. Oh, sorry. Obviously, I need to select the right environment, and then it should work. All right, so I think it did it. Did it? It is. Okay, so what it basically did is, as you can see here, so this is my script, and you can see that I replaced the actual secret and ID with the client ID and the client secret. This it will take from the environment key in Postman. And then what it does afterwards is runs this test script and stores the result, the bearer token. It will extract the bearer token from the response, and we'll store that in that token field. So now if I would go in there, I'm not going to because you will see my keys, but it will actually have a token in there. And now, next script, I can just, instead of doing the actual bearer token, I just refer again to the key in the environment. So let me just do this one here, run that one, and look at that. It gives me the results. So play around with Postman, super useful. Especially because you can store everything and it syncs across machines. So start working with these tools, and now we're actually going to see some code being developed here by Tom. So let me pull up your slide. Oh, you don't have any slides, so right. He goes straight into the demo.
That's right. I'm an engineer, so fewer slides is better. This is the identity and access management page that Joel mentioned in the UI inside of Citrix Cloud. You can find it in the hamburger menu and the API access tab here. Creating a client is super easy. Type a name, click Create Client, and you'll get the client ID and secret. So once I've done this, now what can I do with it? Well, Joel showed some of the things. One of the things Joel mentioned is doing a silent install. So I wanted to show how we can do that. Here what I have on this customer, I have a resource location that is empty. I have no connectors in it. And so let's go and do a silent install. So when you download the connector binary, it has a /? that will pop up and show you the command line parameters for this. So I don't know if you can see that, but the parameters you pass in /q for doing a silent install, /customer, and the client ID and secret that you get from the UI. The resource location ID you can also get from the UI. You can see that here if you click the button. And then the last one is an optional accept terms of service. Now this is almost always not needed because when you log into the UI of Citrix Cloud, if there's any terms of service change, you can accept that right there. But if you've set up a script that you're running for 6 months, and during that 6 months the terms of service change, the connector will not install until you accept the terms of service. So that command line parameter is put there as a way for you to say, even if the terms of service changed, I'm just going to accept them and move on with it. So my command line here, I'm going to use my customer called a summit demo, and I get that from the identity and access management page again. You can see that right here. My client ID and secret I have in my environment, and the /q does the silent install, and I kick that off and it completely runs in the background. Within about 10 minutes that connector will be up and running inside of Citrix Cloud, ready to go. But what can I do besides that? Well, if I want to start to get those resource location IDs, let's go to a customer that has more resource locations so that we can kind of see a little more interesting demo. I have multiple of these and I can get them from the UI, but why am I going to the UI for things? This is an API session. Let's get those resource location IDs from the API instead. So the first thing that you have to do before calling any API, as Joel mentioned, is you need to get the bearer token. And if we go to the developer.cloud.com portal, there's a page, authenticate to Citrix Cloud using an API client. And this tells you what you have to send and the type of response you receive when you send that. And you notice that what I'm sending in here is the client ID and secret, and what I get back includes the token that I need. And there's also a PowerShell example and a C# example. So I tend to like C#, so here's that code just simply copied and pasted in. Now I'm running this on a Mac, so I'm using .NET Core. This absolutely works the same on Windows with .NET Core or with the full .NET, no problem at all. And so let's look at what this is doing. So he's calling, first it creates a JSON representation of an object with the client ID and secret. It then calls post to the URL where you actually exchange that for a bearer token. The error handling here is super simplistic. What this does is just crash the program if there's any error. Probably in a production app you would do something a little smarter. And then I extract the string that I get back and convert it back into an object and get the token property from it. So let's run that, make sure it actually works.
So that in a way is very similar to what Postman does, right?
Yes. Yeah. And so now this is executing my program. It's going to go off and get that. And now when I called this function, I got the client ID and secret. And the way that I got that in a secure way is I got it from the environment. And this is actually a good practice, highly recommended for any application or script that you use. Don't bake those client ID and secret into it. Code tends to be replicated around. Getting that from the environment is a safer way. Getting it from a secure store is even better, but beyond the scope of what we're presenting here. So what I'm calling here is just get bearer token, and then I'm writing out the first 20 characters of it. So that worked. Good. Okay, so now I have the bearer token. I'm ready to move on to the next step, which, if you remember, I'm trying to get the resource locations. And if we go back to the documentation, it actually is documented here under Global APIs. And again, there's examples, a C# example here that shows you how to do this. Let's look at the code in Visual Studio. So I'm skipping over the part about the bearer token. We already looked at that. What I have now is I'm just going to have a function called get resource locations. Now every time that you make a call, you have to tell the system that you want a JSON response back. So that's an accept header. Then you pass in the authorization header is in a very special format. It's CWS auth as the scheme and bearer equals token as the parameters. This call happens to be in the registry service, and if we go into the registry service directly, you can find API documentation for this call that shows you exactly what you're going to get back. A list of items, each item having ID, name, and a Boolean value of whether it's internal only. I don't really care about internal only, so I'm going to represent that as some types, a collection that just has a list of items, and then each of those items is a resource location response object that has ID and name. And now, once I've implemented this, I can start to use it in a type-safe way in C#. So I can get the properties out of those objects, and the compiler will complain if I try to do something that isn't actually going to work. Let's try this out. And I've also, I've done something kind of naive here. I'm actually getting a bearer token every time I run the program. So it does take a little longer than the approach that Joel showed, where you get the bearer token once. Highly recommended to get the bearer token once and reuse it for the life of your program. It takes about 5 seconds to get the bearer token each time. And once you get it, it's good for an hour. So good to reuse that. But here you can see I'm getting back those IDs, and now I could put this into a script where I install connectors into those resource locations or whatever I need to do with them. So I know a lot of you are probably thinking, this is great, but what's the C# nonsense? I use PowerShell, right? Well, one of the great things about this REST and JSON world of the web is that you can use it from any language, including PowerShell. In fact, PowerShell has fantastic support for REST calls. So here's the getBearerToken function that we saw in C#. You take in the client ID in secret. You create what's called a hash map in PowerShell that has the properties that you want to send as a JSON object. And PowerShell has a built-in function called convert to JSON that'll convert that into the right string representation. Setting my headers is as simple as some built-in parameters in the PowerShell call. And then this invoke REST method handles a lot of the heavy lifting. It'll set the accept header so that it gets back JSON, and then it'll convert the response into a type-safe object automatically. So it becomes very simple to use. If you want the token out of the response, it's just there as a property. Get resource locations. Now I'm setting the authorization header, and again I need the CWS auth scheme and the bearer equals token as the parameter. And now when I want to execute this, I just get the bearer token and then use that, pass that into my get resource locations, and PowerShell does the rest. So let's do that. Now I am on a Mac, but luckily PowerShell works on a Mac. Now normally I would build this in as a function that's just available in my shell, and then I can call that function from any script. I'm taking a few shortcuts here just to keep it simple. Now here you can see PowerShell has taken those responses, converted them to objects, even formats it into a table as output all automatically. So what else can I do with this? Well, another common question that we get from customers is I want to know how many days are remaining on my orders. I want to know what I've ordered across all my services, how many users of each service, how many days are remaining there, whether it's in trial or production, so that you can feed that back into business processes and know, hey, when I get down to 20 days remaining or 30 days remaining, I want to start emailing people and getting them involved, just to make sure that things are not going to run out. So here's a function that is implemented in PowerShell, again, to do the same kind of approach. So what I'm calling here is an API called service states. Again, this API is documented in the portal already. So there's a page on this one. And the response that you get back, again, a list of items. It tells you each service, the state of the service, whether it's production or trial, the quantity, which might be number of users for each service, and it also tells you the interesting information we're looking for, the days to expiration. And so let's go and call that function and see what we've got here. And again, PowerShell, now this time it's going to have too many properties for it to format it as a table. But it is giving me all that data that I wanted. Let's actually create a report from this so that we can do more with it. Again, PowerShell has some built-in commands to help me, so I can just convert it to CSV and then send it into a file. And now I can open that file in Excel, and I have an instant report. So you start to see what you can do with these APIs when you're able to integrate with them, when you're able to pull this out. Now I could build charts, do whatever I want to do with this data. It's not all constrained in the Citrix Cloud UI. I can get it out into my other programs, into my other processes. So another interesting question that we get from customers is there's notifications in the UI of Citrix Cloud that you guys are probably familiar with. In fact, I have a notification here. Actually, that's the wrong one. No, that is the right one. So these are notifications that are coming out of the customer and are coming out of things like the connector and the Zen mobile service, and you can see here, and other things within Citrix Cloud, things that admins need to take action on to prevent potential future outages or to see when warnings happen. And customers want to be able to get this into their own notification system. They want to get it into their PagerDuty or whatever. And Citrix Cloud has what's called webhooks that allow you to hook into these notifications and get them out. So again, this one is actually documented on the portal, and it tells you exactly how to do this, but let's look at this inside of PowerShell. Now, this one takes in more data. When you're setting up a webhook, you have to tell it the customer that you want to listen to the notifications on. You can give it an optional description so that you can find that webhook later when you call back. The URL is where you actually want it to call back to. You can also specify authentication. I didn't do that here because my URL is not authenticated that way. But you can tell it that when you call this URL, put in this authorization header so that you can verify that really Citrix Cloud is the one calling you back. And then you can listen to various kinds of changes and events. Change type is things like, are you creating something? Are you deleting something? And then event type is what is the thing that's being created, deleted, updated, etc. Now, I need actually a URL to send that event to, so a great way to handle that is through Azure Functions. So I have a very simple Azure function here. The only thing that's different versus just absolutely creating this out of the box is this one line of code that takes whatever the request is and prints it out in the log. And Azure Functions has a little bit of a bug that sometimes the logs stop listening, but I think that should resolve that. So let's set up that webhook. And as soon as that's done, now I'm not going to wait for a connector event to happen because those may not happen during this session. But once I have the webhook configured, one of the other interesting bits of data that you can get out of this, besides just those notifications, is you can also find out when admins log into a customer. So I'm going to switch back to my customer. And I should see a notification come out of here. Now sometimes it takes 15 or 20 seconds for this for the event to occur here, and looks like it's not going to be happy for me, so I blame the earthquake. Hopefully it'll happen in the next minute or two. The last thing I wanted to show, and we're almost out of time, but I mentioned that one of the critical things that we want to do is we want to be able to support all of the legacy APIs. So if you're familiar with the Zen Desktop PowerShell API, you can use the exact same API with Citrix Cloud. And what I've done here, first I need to add the snap-ins. So you can install the Citrix Remote PowerShell SDK. It's identical to the normal Zen Desktop SDK, except that it has a couple of new commands. It has get XD credentials and set XD credentials. I've already set up a profile called Acme. So let's set those into my current run space. And now I can do things like get broker desktop group. And this is going to now call to Citrix Cloud, get the bearer token for that customer based on the client ID and secret that's baked into that profile, and then make a remote PowerShell SDK call into the Zen Desktop service and give me all the desktop groups that are actually hosted in that service. And all of the Zen Desktop commands, everything that you've come to expect from Zen Desktop over the past 7-8 years that it's in PowerShell is all available here, all works remotely. The only things that you will not be able to do are things like site maintenance, upgrading databases, things like that. And that's because that's the part of the service that Citrix takes over and manages. So those APIs, if you try to call them, that'll just fail with a permissions failure. But all of the other Zen Desktop APIs just work exactly as they always have. And that's it for me. Let's watch Joel log in again.
What I yeah, it did time out, right? What I really liked was, with the Azure functions, I mean, you just did a report or logging of the things, but you can actually, of course, with Azure functions, you can build stuff around that it automates a certain process. So it's actually really, really powerful things you can do. Like Tom said at the beginning, we're not totally there yet, because it would be nice if Zen Desktop Service has native REST APIs, and we're working on that, but there's a lot there. So there will still be some time before we have that all available, but once we do that, you will start seeing documentation appearing on the developer portal. So that's all the time we have, actually. 2 minutes late. It's probably my fault because I didn't time my demo very well. I'm going to blame LastPass security problems. So if there's any question, feel free to come to us after the session. I'm not sure if there's another session after us, so we'll probably be here. Make sure you do the surveys, download the presentations. There's an app. If you want to know more about Citrix Cloud, just select Citrix Cloud as the product. Then you will find all the other Citrix Cloud sessions, which will be tomorrow. So thank you for your patience with us, and I hope you learned something, and have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.